immediately staking a claim in the center, opening diagonals for queen and bishop development. Opening the door for central pawn advances, this knight establishes a flexible defense and prepares for rapid piece development. Asserting central space immediately, white prepares to challenge black's knight and claims territory for future operations. Preparing to fianchetto the bishop, aiming for long-range influence on the dark squares and a solid kingside defense. Developing the knight to c3 efficiently prepares for the central pawn advance, eyeing potential kingside aggression while maintaining flexibility. Developing the bishop to its natural diagonal prepares kingside castling and creates a formidable attacking battery along the dark squares, while challenging white's central control. Seizing central space, white now aims to exploit the open lines this pawn push creates, potentially leading to swift piece development and attacking opportunities. Solidifying the center and preparing for castling, this move opens up the queen's diagonal while subtly challenging white's pawn structure. Solidifying the center's pawn structure and preparing kingside castling are key priorities here. Securing the king is paramount, allowing pieces to develop more freely toward the center. Unpinning the knight opens up the g-file and prepares a potential kingside assault, while also creating immediate pressure on black's kingside pawn structure. Challenging the center aggressively, black immediately contests white's central pawn structure and opens lines for potential piece play, creating a dynamic imbalance early on. The pawn advances, seizing central territory and restricting black's knight, while simultaneously opening the path for white's own pieces. Unleashing a central pawn break, black challenges white's spatial grip by opening lines for their pieces, potentially creating dynamic counterplay on the queen side and forcing white's hand in the center. Developing the knight to f3 solidifies the center, eyeing the d4 pawn and preparing for potential kingside castling, while also preventing any immediate kingside pawn thrusts from black. Challenging the bishop's placement, h6 directly questions white's aggressive pawn thrust, aiming to disrupt the bishop's influential diagonal and potentially create a haven for the king. This pawn advance, while seemingly defensive, can subtly alter the dynamic of the kingside pawn structure. Retreating the bishop here isn't about immediate attack, but rather subtly reinforcing the center's pawn structure and preparing for a slow, positional squeeze. Observe how the pawn chain on d4 and e4 gains a bit more breathing room, while simultaneously scouting for potential weaknesses on black's kingside after the pawn advances on the queen side. This maneuver might even be a prelude to a kingside pawn storm down the line, depending on black's reaction to the preserved bishop's gaze. Opening the central diagonal offers a chance to disrupt white's pawn structure, though it concedes a slight space advantage and might invite the opponent to centralize pieces aggressively. Opening the c-file immediately creates a dynamic tension, challenging black's central structure and forcing them to decide whether to preserve their pawn chain or open lines for white's pieces. Unleashing the pawn storm on the kingside, black aggressively challenges the pinned knight and aims to disrupt white's central dominance. This gambit sacrifices material for dynamic counterplay, creating a complex pawn structure that will demand precise calculation from both sides to navigate the ensuing tactical skirmishes. White must carefully consider how to exploit the weakened kingside defenses or retreat to a more solid position. Retreating the bishop from the pawn's aggressive advance maintains a defensive posture, but it sacrifices the initiative to black's expanding kingside presence. A bold foray into white's territory, this knight repositioning aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack, though it does leave the king's defense slightly exposed on the queen side. A strategic repositioning, aiming to reroute the knight to a more active square, possibly f3 or even e5, while simultaneously reinforcing the kingside and preparing to contest the central files more effectively. Shattering the symmetry, black initiates a bold pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and seize the initiative on the kingside. Opening the h-file creates immediate attacking potential, but also exposes your own king to potential counterplay down that same avenue. Black's pawn push has granted central space and a good bishop, yet sacrificed pawn structure on the kingside. This exchange significantly alters the strategic landscape, potentially simplifying into an endgame where the open file becomes a key factor. Activating the knight to d7 now aims to support the central pawn push, e5, thereby challenging white's imposing pawn structure and seeking to liberate black's kingside. A fascinating attempt to inject dynamism into the center, but it risks overextending the knight before the pawn structure is fully solidified. The knight's placement on the flank may seem active, yet it leaves a void in the queenside's defense and invites potential pawn breaks from black. Consider how this piece might be challenged and what opportunities it inadvertently presents for black's counterplay. Black's queen bravely ventures to the 7th rank, a daring maneuver to consolidate the pieces and prepare for a potential queenside advance, while simultaneously shielding the kingside from immediate threats, though it does create a temporary vacuum on the f7 square. Shifting the knight to e3 fortifies the e4 pawn and prepares a potential kingside advance, while also opening a diagonal for the queen. A bold attempt to untangle piece play and open lines for counterplay, this knight's sortie aims to disrupt white's central grip and perhaps exploit the g-file. Black sacrifices a tempo to activate the knight, potentially creating threats on the queenside or preparing for a kingside attack if white falters. The challenge lies in ensuring the knight doesn't become a target on the far side of the board, especially with white's pieces poised for activity. Unleashing the queen's pressure along the c-file, this move prepares to exploit the open lines and potential weaknesses in black's kingside after the pawn structure has been compromised. The knight's repositioning to e8 subtly supports the central pawn structure and opens a line for the rook, hinting at future aggressive intent on the kingside or a desire to reinforce the d6 pawn. Opening up diagonals for the bishop, white aims to exploit the slightly exposed black king and pressure the c6 pawn. Black's rook, previously tucked away in reserve, now stakes a claim on the open d-file, a crucial artery of the board, and begins to eye potential entry points into white's territory, specifically the d5 pawn, which is currently well supported but could become a target if white's central structure shifts. Re-establishing the bishop on its most natural square, e2, consolidates white's control over the central diagonal and prepares to support a potential kingside pawn advance, or to simply add another piece to the defensive structure, creating a more robust shield for the king which may soon need to weather an assault. The recapture of the bishop on e2, while seemingly returning material, sacrifices critical tempo and allows white to solidify their central pawn structure and potentially prepare a kingside attack. Black's pieces feel somewhat disconnected, with the knight on f6 lacking immediate scope and the rook on d8 passively observing. The decision to move the rook back to e8 after the pawn push on d6 feels like a concession, allowing white's pieces to gain greater influence over key squares and potentially creating weaknesses in black's pawn chain. White now has a comfortable spatial advantage and can continue to develop their forces with a clear plan. Attempting to shore up the pawn chain and create a defensive bulwark against black's kingside pressure, f3 injects a dose of rigidity into white's position, potentially sacrificing some dynamic potential for structural integrity, while simultaneously opening a precarious diagonal for the king. The knight's repositioning to h7 aims to escape the current pawn chain's confines, seeking a more active post on f6 or g5, while simultaneously preparing to support a kingside pawn advance or contest the crucial e-file. Unleashing the kingside pawn storm, white aims to disrupt black's harmonious setup and seize vital territory, though it comes at the cost of weakening their own monarch. The knight's retreat to f8 might seem passive, but it's a strategic repositioning aimed at reinforcing the kingside and potentially preparing a maneuver through g6 or h7. Black isn't just retreating, he's looking to redeploy his forces. Consider the impact on the kingside pawn structure. That g4 pawn from white is now a target, and the knight's return offers defensive capabilities. Embracing the flank, this maneuver aims to establish control over the queenside, potentially creating a powerful outpost for the knight and limiting black's counterplay. The knight's journey to g6, rerouting from the queenside, suggests a desire to reinforce the kingside and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure, although it concedes some central influence and creates a slight backwardness on the h-file. The king scurries to safety, abandoning the G1A7 diagonal and potentially seeking a more sheltered post behind the pawns. Steering the rook towards the queenside offers a subtle bid for queenside presence, potentially creating future attacking prospects along the b-file and putting pressure on white's somewhat passive pawn structure. Reasserting control over the bishop's diagonal, this maneuver aims to disrupt black's cozy queenside setup and potentially force weaknesses, though it risks entering a passive pin if black responds with sufficient counterplay. The knight's detour to d8, after a circuitous journey, seems to be a passive repositioning rather than an active threat, hinting at a desire to connect the rooks and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside. But it leaves the e-file somewhat uncontested and doesn't directly challenge white's growing space advantage on the queenside. Aimed at seizing the initiative, this knight leap to f5 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside, forcing a reaction. Exchanging the bishop removes a key defender of white's kingside and also opens the g-file, which could become a long-term weakness. This simplifies the position, and black seeks to exploit the now less secure white monarch. Unlocking the d-file for your rooks after the bishop's retreat presents a significant opportunity. Focus on coordinating those pieces now. That knight ventures deep into enemy territory, a bold probe into white's somewhat exposed kingside. While it may seem active, this piece now occupies a square where it could become a target, potentially leading to its removal and opening lines for white's attack. Consider how this knight's position might compromise the coordination of black's remaining forces. Its current forwardness could also be a symptom of a lack of central control, as white's pawns are firmly entrenched there. Look ahead. What potential tactical traps might this knight's presence create or fall into? A sharp, dual-purpose maneuver. This knight hops forward to stake a claim in the center and simultaneously prepare a potential kingside assault, aiming to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's king and the open g-file. Black seeks to contest the queenside initiative, aiming to break white's pawn structure and potentially activate the c8 bishop. This thrust challenges the a4 pawn and opens the door for further queenside play if white isn't careful, but it also creates potential weaknesses along the b7 and c6 squares that white might exploit. Retreating the bishop to a defensive posture on the e2 square sacrifices valuable tempo and relinquishes the initiative that white had painstakingly cultivated, allowing black to consolidate their position and potentially prepare for a dangerous queenside expansion with a timely b5. Navigating the complexities of this isolated pawn structure, black subtly shifts the knight to a more flexible outpost, preparing to potentially challenge white's kingside space advantage. Attempting to solidify the kingside structure by reinforcing the e-file, this maneuver seeks to neutralize the immediate threats and prepare for a potential central advance, although it sacrifices tempo and neglects the increasingly vulnerable dark squares around white's monarch. Probing for weaknesses, nf6 attempts to dislodge the aggressive knight on e3 and open possibilities around the central squares. Re-establishing piece connectivity and reinforcing the center with the knight redeployment aims to secure white's central pawn structure and prepare for further maneuvering, potentially towards the kingside where black's king currently lacks sufficient defenders. Pivoting the queen to d7 aims to reroute it, seeking a more active post, perhaps by aiming towards the kingside or supporting a central advance, while simultaneously unpinning the knight on f6 and potentially creating counterplay if white overcommits on the queenside. Aggressively probing the queenside flank, this advance seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and create an overextended position on the queenside, potentially isolating pieces or opening lines for future infiltration. Relocating the rook to the open rank is a strategic repositioning, aiming to establish a more active presence and potentially support an eventual queenside advance or reinforce the central defense. Focusing on reinforcing the kingside and preparing a potential pawn storm, this repositioning of the monarch aims to create a more secure haven, anticipating black's intentions to exploit open diagonals or files. Embracing the initiative, black redirects the queen to a more active central square, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially initiate a queenside initiative. Shifting the rook to the flank aims to create a more flexible defense, perhaps preparing for a potential pawn push later or offering support to a knight that might be repositioned. Exploiting white's passive rook placement, black ignites a pawn chain rupture, aiming to dismantle white's central structure and introduce attacking possibilities along the newly opened queen file. Seeking a safer haven, the white monarch navigates away from the open files, prioritizing king safety amidst the growing queenside pressure, acknowledging the encroaching pawns that threaten to unravel the pawn structure. The rook on e3 boldly stakes its claim, aiming to penetrate white's position and exploit the awkward placement of the king. It disrupts the carefully constructed pawn chain on the queen side, creating immediate pressure and forcing white to dedicate resources to its defense. Reasserting central control and threatening to pry open the queen side, this redeployment of the queen hints at a potential shift in white's strategy from defensive maneuvering to more active queenside expansion, possibly preparing a future b4 push. The RB8 maneuver aims to unblock the c4 square for potential pawn pushes, while simultaneously bringing another rook into the action on the e-file, adding pressure to white's king side and preparing for a potential pawn storm or piece infiltration. Reasserting control over the central files, the rook's repositioning aims to break the stalemate and challenge black's impressive pawn chain, potentially forcing concessions or creating weaknesses for a future attack. A bold gambit to break open the kingside and exploit the awkwardly placed white king. Preparing to double rooks on the open e-file aims to intensify pressure on black's potentially exposed king, but it sacrifices valuable time and leaves the queenside vulnerable to black's advanced pawn. A bold sacrifice, plunging the knight into white's position, aiming to shatter the pawn's shield protecting the king and create immediate tactical chaos. Capturing the knight on g4 decisively resolves the immediate threat, simplifying the board and transforming a tense situation into a more manageable exchange. The rook's sacrifice, aiming to unravel white's kingside pawn structure and open lines, boldly challenges the established order. Black seeks to disrupt white's currently solid position. Relocating the monarch to the side of the board, white seeks to extricate their king from the central fray, a necessary maneuver given the surrounding pawn structure and the potential for discovered attacks. Attempting to regroup the queen to a more active square, preparing for potential exchanges, and seeking to untangle black's pieces from their current cramped position. Stabilizing the king's immediate environment, a pragmatic decision given the opponent's threatening pawn storm advancing on the king side. Striking at white's pawn chain with bxc3 opens a diagonal for the black bishop and aims to dismantle the interconnected structure that white has painstakingly built. This captures a key defender and potentially creates weaknesses around the king, hinting at a future assault on the king side. Opening the queen side is a drastic measure, but it might offer a glimmer of hope for white to disrupt black's formidable pawn structure and potentially create some imbalanced play before black's pieces fully organize for an attack. Sacrificing the rook opens a critical diagonal for the black bishop, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and create immediate tactical threats along the now clear kingside. Reigniting the attack, white brings the rook to bear on the king's flank, aiming to exploit the open lines and potentially create mating threats against black's vulnerable monarch, especially with that g-pawn now exposed. The rook's repositioning to the third rank creates a new layer of pressure on white's vulnerable king, exploiting the open files and the compromised pawn structure, while simultaneously bolstering black's attacking potential. Abandoning the exposed king to his fate, white decides to simplify the position by exchanging rooks, aiming to exploit the doubled pawns on the kingside, and hopefully create some counterplay with his active queen and bishop pair. The queen's rerouting to the center after the rook exchange offers a renewed opportunity to exploit the weakened kingside. A pivotal exchange, simplifying to an endgame where white's isolated pawn on h3 will become a significant weakness, while black's passed pawn on the queenside offers strong winning chances. The knight's foray into the center now becomes a crucial element, potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain and exploiting the lingering weakness on the g-file, promising a more dynamic endgame.